The market square was no place for mercy. Dust swirled in the spring air, carrying the stink of manure, sweat, and smoke. Men jostled with heavy boots, their laughter rough, while women whispered behind aprons. Children peered wide-eyed, their curiosity sharper than pity. Into this circle of eyes, Mabel stumbled forward, her father shoved hard enough to sting her arm. "Half the price of a steer," he barked, his voice like rust scraping metal. "She can cook, she can sew, and she won't talk back." The word struck Mabel harder than the shove. She kept her chin low, her cheeks hot with shame, though the sun was barely out. She remembered another day, a wedding dress, a husband's house, promises whispered in candlelight. All of it torn from her because her womb had betrayed her. Barren tree, they had called her. And now, she was a bargain to be traded, like cracked pottery on the block. The crowd's laughter rolled on, cruel and easy. A younger wife somewhere in the back flaunted her lace gloves, touching her belly as if to prove what Mabel never could. Then the crowd hushed. Heavy bootsteps broke the rhythm, steady, certain. A tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, shirt stained with sap and sawdust, hat pulled low. He didn't haggle, didn't ask questions, just dropped a leather pouch of coins onto the table. Her father sneered. "Sure she don't come with a refund?" The man looked at Mabel, not long, not soft, but steady, and then back to her father. "She won't be judged anymore." That was all. No more words. He turned and walked toward the dust road, leaving silence behind him, and Mabel, trembling, picked up her satchel and followed. Arrival at the cabin, 3 to 6 o'clock. The mule cart creaked over rutted tracks, its wheels dragging through creek beds and stretches of prairie that seemed to stretch into forever. Mabel sat stiff on the wooden seat, her satchel pressed tight against her lap, the taste of tin from the canteen still in her mouth. Silence hung between them, thick but not cruel. Silas drove with one hand, reins loose, eyes fixed ahead. His face was weathered but not old, his hands scarred and splintered from years of labor. She wondered if this was a man who spoke little because words cost more than they were worth. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with bands of gold and violet, they turned into a grove of pine and cottonwood. There was his home, a cabin that looked as though it had grown from the forest itself. Roof patched with hides, porch sagging with age, a wagon wool leaning against the barn. Chickens scattered at the cart's approach, squawking indignantly. Curtains shifted, for small faces peered out from the window, wide eyes, cheeks red with cold, suspicion written in their silence. Boys, mostly, with one girl in the middle, her hair a tangle. They didn't smile. They didn't wave. Silas spoke at last. "This is Miss Mabel. She'll be staying." The words fell like stone into a pond, rippling through the small household. The youngest, no more than 3, toddled over and clung to his father's leg. Silas lifted him easily, pushing open the door with his other hand. Inside smelled of pine resin, bread gone stale, and the faint musk of children's socks. The floorboards groaned underfoot. Mabel carried her satchel upstairs to a narrow room. The bed was small but neat, a single window overlooking the field. She sat down, her legs trembling, and for the first time since the market, let the tears slip soundless on her hands. First turning point. Proving worth, 6 to 9 o'clock. The days came slow at first, stitched together with small mistakes and quiet trials. Mabel burned the beans twice, fumbled bread dough until it sagged heavy as clay, and pricked her fingers raw trying to mend socks that always seemed to tear anew. The children watched her like wary pups, waiting for the shout, the slap, the anger that always came when things went wrong. But it never came. One evening, when she spilled half a pot of stew across the floor, she froze, heart pounding, sure of the punishment. Silas only bent down, scooped up the pot, and said, "It's only stew. No sai. No temper. Just the plain words of a man who'd seen worse." Then came the storm. The wind screamed through the pines, rattling the patched roof. Rain poured sideways through the blanket nailed over the doorway. In the midst of it, Hannah, the little girl with tangled hair, burned hot with fever. Her cheeks flushed crimson, her small body trembling, eyes glassy with heat. Silas, the man who could split logs in a single swing, stood helpless beside her bed, sweat on his brow though the night was cold. Mabel moved without thought. She crushed willow bark into boiling water, brewed mint leaves, laid cool cloths across Hannah's forehead. Her hands did not stop, turning the child, wiping her skin, humming low and unsteady but constant through the long hours. The storm outside howled. The fever inside raged. But Mabel never faltered. By dawn, Hannah stirred, whispering hoarsely about pancakes. Relief broke like light through the cabin. Silas stood in the doorway, arms folded, his face unreadable, except for the way his shoulders dropped, the tension gone. He looked at Mabel as though she had worked some holy spell. And for the first time, Mabel saw herself not as barren, but as necessary. Town confrontation, 9 to 11:30. Weeks passed before Silas asked her to ride with him into town. He said little, only handed her the reins as if to see whether she'd take them. The wagon rolled over the dirt road, past split-rail fences and fields bent low from the weight of late spring. Mabel's hands sweated on the leather strap, not from the sun, but from the thought of faces she might see again. The town bustled with its usual noise, wagons creaking, merchants calling prices, gossip thick in the air like smoke. Mabel stepped down from the wagon while Silas waited in line for salt and nails. She had barely reached the dry goods stand when a sharp, cutting voice froze her in place. Well, if it ain't the barren ghost herself. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned. There stood her former mother-in-law, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. Beside her, the younger wife, smug, pretty in a practiced way, lace gloves gleaming, laid one hand against her still flat belly, as though rehearsing for the child she had promised. "That's her," the girl said loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes," the older woman sneered. "Pretty but cursed. Couldn't give us even a pup." "I will," the younger one declared, chin lifted. "A strong son, and he'll carry the name. Not like her. Useless as a cracked jug." The word struck hard, but Mabel didn't speak. Her throat was thick with everything unsaid. She turned to leave. Then a hand settled on her shoulder. Silas, dirt still on his boots, eyes steady as storm clouds. He looked at the two women without blinking, then spoke low enough to still the air. "She's the only one who gets my daughter to sleep. The only one who taught Benji not to throw stones. The only one who makes our house feel like it has a roof." The market fell silent. Neither woman dared reply. Silas simply took Mabel's arm and led her away. For the first time, she realized someone had stood beside her, not with pity, but with pride. Bond with the children, 11:30 to 14:30. The children did not warm to her overnight. Trust in a house stitched with loss came slow, like thaw after a long winter. Josiah, the eldest, narrowed his eyes whenever she corrected him. Eli, louder and always hungry, tested her patience at every meal. Hannah still clung to her father's leg, as though Mabel might vanish if she blinked. And little Benji trailed her shadow, silently, too young to say her name, but unwilling to let her stray far. Mabel did not press. Instead, she began with small things. She tore scraps of cloth into makeshift scarves, stitching them by lamplight and laying them across the children's beds. She traced letters in charcoal on planks of wood, showing Josiah how to write his name, steadying his hand when it shook. She taught Eli to sing simple rhymes between bites of bread, laughed when he forgot the words, and invented new ones. With Hannah, she knelt patiently, showing her how to weave a ribbon through hair until the girl finally let her small fingers relax in hers. At night, when thunder rolled far off the ridge, she sat by the bed and hummed an old lullaby, the one her own mother had once sung before shame turned her quiet. Her voice trembled, uncertain, but the children listened anyway. One afternoon, as she lifted Benji onto her hip, he buried his face against her shoulder and whispered a garbled word. It took her a moment to hear it clearly. Manga. Her breath caught. She froze, the world tilting for just an instant. She had been called barren, cursed, broken. But this name had not been given by blood or law. It had been spoken by a child who simply believed it true. And for Mabel, it was more than enough. Conflict with Jed, 1430 to 1630. The night was heavy with the scent of pine pitch and damp earth. Mabel had stepped out to fetch water from the well, the lantern flame flickering weak against the dark. She didn't notice the man at first, leaning against the fence post, half hidden in shadow. Jed, the trapper from down the ridge. His breath reeked of whiskey, his grin lopsided and mean. "Well, look who it is," he slurred, pushing off the post. "Silas's little prize from the market. Thought you were barren, but seems you've been raising his pups just fine." Mabel stiffened. "It's late, Jed. Go home." He chuckled, stepping closer. "Just wanted to look. Silas keeps you locked up tighter than a coin purse. Seems unfair." She turned to leave, but his hand shot out, closing around her wrist. "Rough. Too tight." His voice dropped, low and sour. "Come on now. You owe us all a little smile after all that gossip." Her breath snapped short. She opened her mouth to cry out, but a shadow moved from the barn, fast as thunder. Silas. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and struck hard, one clean punch to Jed's jaw. The man crumpled like wet canvas, dust rising where he fell. Silas stood over him, chest heaving, blood trickling from a split knuckle. He didn't look at Jed. He looked at her. "You all right?" His voice was low, steady, dangerous in its calm. Mabel's hands trembled. She nodded, though her throat felt raw. "I'm sorry," she whispered without knowing why. Silas stepped closer, pulled the red kerchief from his neck, and gently wrapped it around her wrist where Jed had grabbed her. "No one touches you," he said, firm as iron. "Not unless I say." Later, she washed his bleeding knuckles with boiled water, neither speaking much. The silence was not empty. It was charged with something fragile, something unnamed but alive. Transformation. Chosen love, 1630 to 2030. It happened on a morning lined with frost, when the earth crunched underfoot and the breath of every living thing rose white into the air. A scream shattered the quiet. High, sharp, unmistakably a child's. Mabel dropped the dough bowl where she stood, flowers scattering like snow, and ran barefoot toward the woodpile. Caleb, the youngest boy, lay crumpled near the axe. His leg twisted beneath him, blood already staining his trousers. Silas knelt, his hands steady though his face was taut with fear. "Go boil water," he said, his voice clipped but calm. "Bandages, top shelf of the pantry." Mabel ran, hands fumbling, heart hammering. By the time she returned, Silas had laid the boy on the table, the pants cut away to reveal the gash. Blood welled bright, hot, unrelenting. Her hands shook, but she pressed cloth to the wound, whispering comfort even as tears blurred her sight. Caleb cried out, clutching her sleeve. "Don't cry, Mama," he gasped through clenched teeth. The words stunned her. "Mama." His lips trembled, his voice small but certain. "You make the best biscuits. You sing soft like my real mama used to." Her throat closed. She cupped his cheek with a trembling hand, pressing harder on the wound, binding, nodding, praying with every motion. By nightfall, his fever eased, his breathing evened. And when the other children gathered close, none questioned the word he had spoken. Josiah brought her a blanket. Hannah curled into her side. Eli whispered, "Does this mean you're a mama now?" Mabel could only nod, and that was enough. Later, when the cabin was still, Silas stood with her on the porch, eyes shadowed, voice low. "Why put coin down that day? I thought I was giving you a way out. I never thought I had a right to keep you." He paused, jaw working. "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." Mabel's chest tightened. Her voice was steady when she answered. "Love isn't being chosen once. It's being chosen again, after people see who you really are." She looked at him, every word trembling but true. "And I'm not leaving." The garden, rebirth symbolism, 2030, 27:00. Summer came cruel that year. 7 weeks passed without rain, and the land grew brittle, cracked like an old man's hands. The creek behind the cabin shrank to a sluggish trickle. Corn curled brown in the fields. Beans withered to husks. Even the chickens scratched listlessly in the dust. The children counted potatoes at supper like marbles, each smaller than the last. Silas grew gaunter by the day, his shoulders heavier, his eyes hollow. But Mabel would not bow to silence. She woke before dawn, filled every bucket from the deepest well, and carried them to the garden plot. With hands wrapped in cloth against the blisters, she broke the hardened ground. She dug, turned, and watered, even when the dirt swallowed the moisture greedily. At night, she returned with a lantern, kneeling, singing old lullabies as she poured water carefully at the roots. "Grow," she whispered. "Grow even if no one believes you can." Neighbors shook their heads. Some pitied her, some mocked. But Mabel worked on, her back bent, her skirts heavy with sweat. Then Silas collapsed. One evening, he stumbled through the door, pale as paper, his body burning with fever. Mabel stayed at his side for 2 nights, wiping sweat from his brow, spooning broth past cracked lips, whispering promises into the dark. He muttered once in delirium, "Don't leave me, Mabel. Not you too." She leaned close, lips against his temple. "I'm not going anywhere. Here, I am needed." By dawn, his fever broke. When his eyes opened, she was there, hair unkempt, dirt smudged on her cheeks, but steady, strong. He managed a hoarse chuckle. "You look like hell." She laughed, relief breaking through. "You should see yourself." Outside, something stirred. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, stubborn, defiant, alive. Days later, Eli came running, shouting, "May, there's a tomato!" They gathered around the single red fruit, clinging to its vine. Silas stared at it like a miracle. "Ow!" Mabel met his gaze. "Because you taught me not everything worth keeping comes easy." That night, the tomato was sliced into slivers thinner than a coin, shared between 6 mouths. Everyone swore it was the sweetest thing they'd ever tasted. And later, by firelight, Silas took her blistered hands in his and kissed each knuckle, soft as falling rain. Legacy Defiance, 27:00, 30:30. Years turned, and the garden thickened like a hymn that refused to fade. Not just tomatoes now, but beans, onions, mustard greens, and sunflowers so tall the children could vanish behind them and play. Mabel's hands left their mark in every root, every fence post, every stone path laid to keep the rows from flooding when the rains finally came back. It was not a grand garden, nor orderly, but it was alive, crooked, stubborn, and utterly theirs. Then one spring, men in dustless coats and polished boots arrived with maps rolled tight under their arms. Railroad men. They stood at the edge of the property, their smiles practiced, their words smooth. "There will be a line through this ridge," one said. "Think of what you could give your children with the money. A better home, real comforts." Mabel stood with Silas on the porch, apron still damp from washing. She said nothing, fingers curled in the fabric. Silas stared past the men to the garden, swaying gently in the breeze. The swing Mabel had tied to the oak for Hannah, the stones marking where the family's old dog lay, the carved bench where he and Mabel had sat through their first hard winter. "No," Silas said simply. The men pressed, flashing numbers and promises. He raised a hand. "This land is not for sale." Later, as the sun dipped, he and Mabel hammered a wooden board at the edge of the road. Painted in rough strokes, it read, "Not for sale." Mabel touched the sign when it was finished, her hand lingering against the grain. Someone had once fought for her to stay. Now this land would hold her, too. Word spread through town. Some mocked him as a fool. Others nodded quietly, understanding more than they admitted. Years passed, children grew, grandchildren followed. The cabin filled with noise, bread baking, small feet clattering across the floor, lullabies whispered again by new voices. The land endured droughts and winters, but the garden never died. It became a root that held the family fast, proof that what was once abandoned could become unshakable. And the sign at the road weathered but never fell. Resolution Epilogue 30:30, 31:34. The seasons moved on, carving years into the faces of all who lived on the ridge. The children married, carried their own little ones back to the cabin, and still the garden grew, spilling past its borders like it refused to be forgotten. Travelers passing the road saw the crooked fence, the creaking porch, and the wooden sign, faded but unbroken, not for sale. One autumn afternoon, Silas's grandson asked why. "Grandpa, why don't you ever just call it Mabel's garden?" Silas led him to the gate, his back bent, but his eyes bright. He pointed to the arch above it, where words had been carved deep into the wood, darkened with years of weather. "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." The boy blinked, young enough not to understand the weight. "You mean she gave you a new start?" Silas smiled. "She gave me everything." When Mabel's time came, they buried her at the foot of the garden, beneath the oak tree where her wind chimes had once danced in the breeze. On the stone, Silas carved a single line by hand. "Here grew everything she was never given, and all that she gave anyway." Each morning after, he sat by that grave until the day he did not rise. They laid him beside her, the garden humming above them, alive with bees, sunflowers, and stubborn greens. The earth, once cracked and barren, carried them both now, refusing to forget. The railroad never touched the ridge. The line bent wide around it, curving past fields where children's laughter still rose. And long after the suits and papers were gone, strangers would stop at the fence, read the old sign, and know someone had loved enough to stay. Because sometimes the land remembers those who chose it. Sometimes a garden grows where no one believes it can. And sometimes on dry hills, love takes root, the kind that cannot be sold, the kind that endures.